the 17th of January 1943, above the frozen coastline of occupied France. The winter sky burns pale and brittle, stretched thin across the horizon like parchment strained over flame. At 23,000 feet, the air cuts through leather and fleece with surgical precision. Ice crystals form on oxygen masks, on gun barrels, on the plexiglass noses of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses as they carve their way east into the grey throat of Hitler's fortress Europe. Inside the lead aircraft, a bombardier from Iowa named Lieutenant James Thornton peers through his Norden bomb sight, his breath coming in shallow, frozen gasps. The intercom crackles with static and the strained voices of 19-year-old gunners scanning the empty sky for the inevitability they all know is coming. Below, the patchwork fields of France lie dormant under snow. Above, contrails streak the atmosphere like chalk marks on a celestial blackboard, equations of war written in ice and exhaust. And somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the range of human sight but never beyond human intuition, German pilots strap themselves into the cockpits of Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Fokker-Wulf W 190 seconds, engines roaring to life with the metallic scream of Daimler-Benz 12 cylinders. They rise like hawks from their scattered airfields, climbing through the winter haze toward an interception that has become as routine as breakfast, as predictable as the tides. But on this morning, something fundamental is shifting in the calculus of aerial warfare, something the German pilots cannot yet comprehend, something that will unravel their understanding of warfare itself. For the Americans have made a decision that defies every rational principle of military doctrine, every calculation of acceptable loss, every historical precedent of how nations fight and when they retreat. The Americans are coming back. They came yesterday. They came the day before. They will come tomorrow. And the Germans, standing beside their aircraft in the pre-dawn cold of occupied airfields from Abbeville to Amsterdam, are beginning to realize they are facing an enemy whose strategic philosophy operates on principles they were never trained to counter. The architects of the Luftwaffe were not fools. They had studied warfare with Prussian thoroughness, had absorbed the lessons of the Great War, had built an air force around principles that seemed unassailable. Hermann Goering, Reichsmarshal and commander of German air forces, had fought in the skies above Flanders, had known the bitter arithmetic of attrition, had watched entire squadrons vanish into the meat grinder of aerial combat. The doctrine he helped establish was ruthlessly pragmatic. Strike hard, strike fast, achieve local air superiority, and when losses mount beyond sustainability, withdraw and reconstitute. This was how rational powers conducted war. This was how the Luftwaffe had crushed Poland, swept through the Low Countries, contested Britain to a standstill. When bomber formations took unsustainable casualties, they pulled back, they reassessed, they waited for favorable conditions. No military force in history had simply absorbed catastrophic losses and returned the next day to do it all over again. Until now. The American 8th Air Force, operating from bases scattered across the English countryside, had begun its strategic bombing campaign against German industry in the summer of 1942. Early missions were modest, tentative strikes against railway yards and submarine pens in occupied France. But by the winter of 1943, the scale had transformed into something unprecedented. Hundreds of bombers, sometimes pushing toward 300 aircraft in a single formation, penetrating deep into German airspace in broad daylight, targeting the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The casualties were obscene. On the 14th of October 1943, 291 B-17 seconds would set out for the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. 60 bombers would not return. 600 men, dead or captured in a single afternoon. The mission would enter the records as Black Thursday, a disaster of such magnitude that it would force a temporary halt to deep penetration raids. But this was autumn. This was months away. What German pilots were witnessing in the winter and spring of 1943 was something even more disturbing. Despite losses that should have broken the offensive, the Americans kept coming. Major Hans-Joachim Hermann, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot with over 150 combat missions, would later describe his growing disbelief. We would shoot down 30, 40 bombers in a single engagement. We would watch them spiral down, trailing fire, watch the parachutes bloom like white flowers against the earth. We would return to base exhausted, exhilarated, certain we had dealt the enemy a crushing blow, and the next morning, the same number of bombers would appear on our radar screens. It was as if we had accomplished nothing, as if our victories meant nothing. This was the equation that didn't balance. This was the strategy that violated every understood principle of warfare. The German pilots were not monsters, though history would remember them that way. They were professionals, many of them. Farm boys from Bavaria and clerks from Hamburg, who had grown up in the wreckage of the Great War, who had known hunger and humiliation, who had been told their suffering had purpose, that the fatherland was rising again, stronger and purer than before. They flew me 109 seconds with the same casual competence that American boys drove Ford pickup trucks, banked and rolled and fired with muscle memory honed through thousands of hours of training. They expected to win because they had always won. In Poland, Luftwaffe fighters had swept Polish PZL fighters from the sky like a farmer clearing birds from a wheat field. In France, the ratio had been similarly lopsided. German air superiority had been established so quickly, so completely, that the Battle of France had essentially been decided in the air before it was fought on the ground. Even against the British during the Battle of Britain, despite their ultimate failure to achieve the necessary superiority for invasion, German pilots had maintained kill ratios that spoke to superior training, superior tactics, superior aircraft. When the Americans first appeared in their heavy bombers, German pilots approached them with something close to pity. The B-17 seconds were impressive machines, certainly 4 engines, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. But they were also enormous targets, lumbering through the sky at less than 200 miles per hour, locked into straight and level flight during their bomb runs. The early engagements seemed to confirm German assumptions. Bombers fell in droves. The mathematics of attrition seemed to be working exactly as predicted. What German pilots expected was a rational enemy. An enemy that would calculate cost versus gain, that would measure losses against strategic objectives, that would eventually conclude the price was too high. What they got instead was something that defied their entire understanding of how nations prosecuted war. Lieutenant Friedrich Lang, a 24-year-old pilot flying out of Wiesbaden, kept a diary through the spring of 1943. His entries chronicle a slow descent from confidence to confusion, to something approaching existential dread. March 8. Shot down 2 bombers today. Clean kills, both into the English Channel. We celebrated tonight. The war will be over by summer. March 15. Another large formation. We hit them hard. I saw at least 20 go down. But more came the next day. Where are they getting these aircraft? March 29. They came again today despite yesterday's losses. Werner says, there is talk that the Americans are building bombers faster than we can shoot them down. This cannot be true. April 12. I am beginning to understand that we are not fighting an air force. We are fighting a factory. This was the truth that slowly crystallized in the minds of German fighter pilots through the winter and spring of 1943, hardening like ice on a windshield. They were not fighting a military force constrained by normal limitations of production, replacement, and morale. They were fighting an industrial system so vast, so incomprehensibly productive, that it could absorb losses that would have crippled any European power and barely register the impact. The numbers told a story that German intelligence officers struggled to credit. In 1942, the United States produced 47,836 aircraft. In 1943, that number would climb to 85,898. In 1944, it would reach 96,318. These were not fighters and trainers padded with obsolete biplanes. These were frontline combat aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. Every hour, around the clock, a 4-engine heavy bomber rolled off the assembly line. To put this in perspective, Germany's total aircraft production in 1943 was 24,807 machines. The United States was outbuilding the entire German aviation industry by a ratio of nearly 4-1. And this was only aircraft. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. American factories were producing tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, rifles, ammunition at rates that seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. German pilots knew their own supply situation. They knew about the chronic shortages of high-octane fuel, the delays in aircraft deliveries, the makeshift repairs that kept aging fighters in service months beyond their designed operational lifespan. They knew that when they lost an experienced pilot, the replacement was likely a boy with 60 hours of flight training, sent up to face American bomber formations defended by gunners who had fired thousands of practice rounds before ever seeing combat. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war. They were fighting a war of abundance. Major Gunther Roll, who would end the war as one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 confirmed kills, described the realization in his post-war memoirs. "We were craftsmen fighting an assembly line. We could shoot down 5, 10, 20 bombers, and it meant nothing. They had more. They always had more. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." But it was not merely the numbers that unsettled German pilots. It was the psychology behind those numbers. It was the implication of a nation that could look at 10% losses, 15% losses, even 20% losses on certain missions, and decide those losses were acceptable, that the mission would continue, that the bombers would return tomorrow. In European military tradition, such losses were catastrophic. They represented organizational failure, strategic miscalculation, grounds for relieving commanders and reassessing doctrine. During the Battle of Britain, when Luftwaffe bomber losses climbed above 5%, the German High Command began to fundamentally question the viability of the campaign. This was the rational response. This was how professional militaries operated. The Americans operated on different principles. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, had made his position brutally clear to his staff and crews. "We will bomb in daylight, we will bomb precision targets, and we will continue bombing until German industry is destroyed, regardless of cost." This was not bravado. This was strategic doctrine rooted in a uniquely American faith in industrial capacity and a uniquely American tolerance for casualty rates that would have seemed obscene to European commanders. The American calculation was coldly rational in its own way. Yes, losses were high, but the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were being replaced faster than they were being destroyed. Yes, trained crews were being lost, but the training pipeline was producing new crews every week, hundreds of young men cycling through flight schools in Texas and Arizona and Colorado, emerging ready to climb into bombers and fly into the flak-torn skies over Germany. More than that, the Americans had calculated that German fighter production, for all its efficiency, could not keep pace with the demands of defending the entire Reich, 24 hours a day, against an enemy that could replace losses indefinitely. Every German fighter shot down, every pilot killed, represented an irreplaceable loss of combat effectiveness. Every German gallon of high-octane fuel burned in combat was a gallon that could not be replaced. The Americans were not trying to win through tactical brilliance. They were trying to win through mathematical inevitability. And slowly, month by month, mission by mission, it was working. The object that came to symbolize this philosophy, this abundance, this alien way of war, was not a weapon. It was a chocolate bar. German pilots who shot down American bombers and survived the subsequent interrogation of captured crew members reported a strange phenomenon. The Americans carried emergency kits stuffed with supplies: morphine, sulfur powder, water purification tablets, fishing line, compasses, maps printed on silk. These were standard survival equipment, but they also carried D-ration chocolate bars, 4-ounce blocks of concentrated chocolate and oat flour designed to provide 600 calories of emergency sustenance. Every American airman carried multiple bars. Some carried half a dozen. To German pilots, accustomed to ersatz coffee and bread stretched with sawdust, accustomed to ration cards and shortages and the daily mathematics of scarcity, this was incomprehensible. The enemy was distributing chocolate to every soldier as if it were ammunition, as if there was enough chocolate in the world to give every fighting man a week's worth of calories in his pocket. The chocolate bar became a symbol, passed hand to hand in Luftwaffe ready rooms, discussed with the kind of bewildered fascination that anthropologists reserve for alien artifacts. It represented something more than logistics. It represented a civilization that could afford to send its warriors into battle carrying luxury goods that most German civilians hadn't tasted in years. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jonnen, describing the interrogation of a captured B-17 co-pilot, noted, "He offered me a piece of his chocolate. Just offered it, casually, as if it were nothing. I accepted. And the taste real chocolate, sweet and rich, was like something from before the war, from childhood. He had 5 more bars in his flight suit. 5. I asked him if he was an officer, if this was special rations. He laughed and said every man in his squadron had the same. I did not believe him, but I think now that he was telling the truth, and that is somehow more disturbing. The chocolate was real. The abundance was real. And what it represented, a nation that could wage war while its citizens still enjoyed peacetime luxuries, a nation that could equip every soldier with supplies that would have been considered extraordinary in Germany. This was perhaps more demoralizing than the bombers themselves. German propaganda tried to counter this. Newsreels showed American bombers being shot down, emphasized the heavy losses, mocked the futility of daylight bombing. But the pilots who actually fought the Americans knew the truth. They saw the formations return. They saw the losses replaced. They saw the tide of material that no amount of skill or courage could ultimately stem. The transformation in German pilot psychology was not instantaneous. It was gradual, cumulative, a slow erosion of certainty that accelerated through 1943 and into 1944. Early in the campaign, there was still confidence, still the belief that enough skill, enough aggression, enough tactical innovation could turn the tide. Luftwaffe aces developed new techniques. Frontal attacks to avoid the B-17's defensive firepower, coordinated assault patterns, aerial rockets that could destroy a bomber from outside machine gun range. And these techniques worked. They killed Americans in extraordinary numbers. On many missions, the loss rates climbed above 10%, sometimes above 15%. These were unsustainable casualties by any historical measure. The bomber crews knew it. They flew their missions with the grim awareness that their chances of surviving a full tour of 25 missions were statistically poor. The terror was real. The losses were real. But the missions continued. There is a particular kind of despair that comes not from defeat but from the realization that victory itself is meaningless. German pilots were winning tactical engagements and losing the strategic war. They were racking up kill counts that would have made them legends in any previous conflict, while watching their nation's industrial capacity erode under the weight of American bombs. They were flying 3, 4, 5 sorties a day, fighting until their aircraft ran out of fuel or ammunition, landing exhausted and traumatized, only to learn that tomorrow's formations would be even larger. By late 1943, experienced German pilots could feel the shift. The Americans were no longer alone. British bombers struck by night while Americans struck by day. A round-the-clock offensive that gave German air defenses no rest, no opportunity to recover and regroup. And the Americans were learning. Bomber formations tightened their defensive boxes. Fighter escorts began to push deeper into German airspace. The P-51 Mustang, with its revolutionary range, began appearing in significant numbers, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The mathematical equation that had seemed so favorable, shoot down enough bombers and the offensive will collapse, was revealed as false. The Americans had more bombers. They had more crews. They had more fuel, more ammunition, more spare parts, more training facilities, more everything. They were fighting a war of attrition they were designed to win. Major Heinz Noak, who flew throughout the campaign and survived the war, wrote in his diary in November, 1943, "Today I shot down my 25th bomber, 25, a number that should mean something, that should represent achievement. But I look at the formations still flying overhead, unbroken, continuing to their targets, and I understand that my victories are tactically meaningless. We are not defeating them. We are merely delaying them. And delay without ultimate victory is just another form of defeat." The crews inside those American bombers were not blind to their own suffering. They knew the odds. They saw their friends torn apart by 20mm cannon fire, saw aircraft disintegrate under the hammer blows of German fighters, saw men fall through empty sky with burning parachutes. The psychological toll was immense. Many bomber crewmen developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1943 it was simply called combat fatigue or shell shock, but they kept flying. This was partly discipline, partly duty, partly the grinding machinery of military command that sends men into danger whether they wish to go or not. But it was also something deeper. The American crews understood, in a way that perhaps only became fully clear in retrospect, that they were waging a different kind of war. They were not trying to achieve a clean victory through brilliant tactics. They were trying to break German industrial capacity through sheer weight of sustained offensive action. Every bomb that hit a ball-bearing factory was a bomb that would slow German tank production 6 months later. Every aircraft factory damaged was a fighter that would never rise to challenge future missions. Every oil refinery struck was fuel that German aircraft would never burn. The strategy was one of systematic destruction, of industrial warfare waged on an unprecedented scale. And crucially, the American crews understood they were replaceable. This sounds grim, dehumanizing, and in many ways it was. But it was also the source of a strange freedom. They were not heroes whose survival was essential to the war effort. They were components in a vast machine, and the machine would continue functioning whether any individual survived or not. There was a kind of dark democracy in this understanding. Every man was essential. Every man was expendable. The mission mattered. The individual did not. German pilots, trained in a tradition that emphasized individual skill and ace culture, found this philosophy incomprehensible and disturbing. To them, combat was personal, a test of courage and ability, arena where individual excellence mattered. The Americans had industrialized warfare to a point where individual excellence was nearly irrelevant. You flew your formation, you dropped your bombs. Whether you were brilliant or merely adequate changed nothing. The system would produce the same outcome. The sound that haunted German fighter pilots was not the roar of engines or the rattle of machine guns. It was the drone, the steady, rhythmic throb of hundreds of Wright Cyclone engines beating the air into submission, a mechanical thunder that rolled across the German countryside like the footsteps of something vast and impersonal. The sound would begin as a distant vibration, felt more than heard, transmitted through the earth and air. Then it would grow, swelling until it filled the entire auditory landscape, until nothing else existed except that pulse of American power. Farmers would hear it in their fields and look up, shading their eyes against the sun, watching the silver formations pass overhead like migrating birds. Children in schools would fall silent, listening to the drone that meant death was traveling to some distant city. And German fighter pilots would hear it through their cockpit canopies, hear it even over the scream of their own engines, and know that whatever happened in the next hour, whether they won or lost their individual battles, that sound would return tomorrow. The drone became the soundtrack of Germany's slow defeat. It was the sound of inevitability, of industrial capacity transformed into strategic power, of a nation that could project force across an ocean and sustain that projection indefinitely. German civilians called the bombers Die Terrorangreifer, the terror attackers. But the terror was not merely in the bombs themselves. It was in the certainty that the bombs would keep falling, day after day, week after week, month after month, without end. By 1944, the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. German pilot quality was deteriorating as experienced veterans were killed and replaced by hastily trained novices. Fuel shortages meant that even when aircraft were available, they often could not fly. American fighter escorts had achieved a level of dominance where bomber formations could penetrate German airspace with relative impunity. The Me-262 jet fighter, a technological marvel that might have challenged American air superiority, arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The pilots who had watched the first American raids in 1942 with confidence were dead, captured, or broken. The new generation of German pilots, 16-year-old boys who had grown up under Nazi indoctrination, who had never known peace, these flew their missions with fatalistic determination, knowing they were not fighting for victory, but simply because the alternative was immediate execution for desertion. Lieutenant Friedrich Lang, whose diary entries chronicled the early days of the campaign, was shot down over the North Sea in July 1943. His aircraft was struck by fire from a B-17's waist gun. The engine seized, and he ditched in the cold water 20 miles off the Dutch coast. He survived 3 hours before hypothermia claimed him. His diary was recovered from his effects and eventually found its way into American archives. The final entry, dated the 11th of July 1943, reads, "They came again today. I knew they would. Tomorrow they will come again. I no longer count my victories. I count the days until this is over, one way or another." Werner says the Americans are not like us. He is right. They fight as if victory is inevitable, as if our resistance is merely a delay. I think now that they may be correct. I think we are watching something new being born: warfare without honor, without individual brilliance, warfare as industrial process. God help us all. The epilogue of this story is written not in the crash sites scattered across France and Germany, not in the burned ruins of German cities, but in the transformation of warfare itself. The Americans proved in the skies over Europe that industrial capacity, properly mobilized, could overcome tactical brilliance, could absorb seemingly catastrophic losses, could sustain offensive operations that would have broken armies of earlier eras. This was not a comfortable truth. It was not a heroic truth. It transformed warriors into workers, combat into production quotas, victory into statistical analysis. But it was effective. By the spring of 1945, German industry was in ruins, German cities were burning, and German fighter resistance had effectively collapsed. The bombers flew their missions without significant opposition, striking targets at will. The drone of their engines a requiem for a nation that had believed willpower could overcome industrial reality. The chocolate bar, that small, mundane object, remained a symbol. After the war, when American GIs occupied Germany, they would hand out chocolate to starving children, would trade it for souvenirs and favors, would use it as currency in a broken economy. The German pilots who survived the war remembered those chocolate bars from captured emergency kits, remembered what they represented: abundance, surplus, a civilization that could fight a global war while its soldiers carried luxuries. There is a photograph from May 1945, taken at a Luftwaffe airfield in Bavaria after the surrender. American airmen and German pilots stand together beside a shot-up Messerschmitt Bf 109, examining the aircraft with professional interest. The Germans look exhausted, hollowed out, years older than their actual ages. The Americans look well-fed, confident, already thinking about going home. In the photograph, one of the American airmen is handing something to a German pilot. The image quality is poor, but researchers have identified the object: a D-ration chocolate bar. The German pilot is accepting it, and in that gesture, the offering and acceptance of this small, symbolic piece of American abundance, there is perhaps the truest summary of what the air war over Europe had really meant. It was never about courage. Both sides had courage in abundance. It was never about skill. German pilots were as skilled as any warriors in history. It was about systems, about industrial capacity, about a nation that could build bombers faster than they could be destroyed and keep sending them back, day after day, regardless of cost, until the mathematics of attrition produced the only outcome they were ever going to produce. The German pilots couldn't believe the American bombers returned even after heavy losses. They couldn't believe it, because it defied everything they understood about warfare, about rational decision-making, about the limits of human endurance and national capacity. They kept expecting the Americans to stop, to realize the cost was too high, to behave like a normal military force. But the Americans were never fighting that kind of war. They were fighting an industrial war, a war of material, a war where the assembly line was as important as the battlefield. They were proving that, in modern warfare, abundance itself could be a weapon, that the capacity to absorb losses and continue could be more valuable than the ability to inflict them, that a nation with enough factories, enough resources, enough sheer productive capacity could simply outlast any enemy, no matter how skilled, how determined, how individually brilliant. It was a cold lesson, a hard lesson. But by the time the war ended, it was a lesson the entire world had learned. The age of the warrior had ended. The age of industrial warfare had begun. And in the skies over Europe, in the drone of those American bombers that kept coming back no matter the cost, the future had announced itself with a sound like thunder that would never stop.